Welcome to the Private Wireless podcast series from Nokia, bringing you the insights that really matter around enterprise digital transformation and wireless solutions. The series covers technology comparisons, deployment best practices, total cost of ownership assessments, analyst reviews and reports to help you make the decisions you need for your business. So keep listening. Joining us again is James Blackman of Enterprise IoT Insights, as he chats to Stefan Doble, Head of Marketing at Nokia Enterprise Solutions. Today's episode looks back at the massive shift in the industrial market around private wireless and the immense milestones accomplished over time.
So, Stefan, part of the challenge with the Industry 4 movement is cultural, right? That these IoT-based technologies must, if they are to drive intelligence in company-wide operations and justify investments in plant-wide or factory-wide private wireless infrastructure, they must bring together two different sides. That IT and OT teams must collaborate to bring this stuff to life. How is that going, Stefan? How well has this IoT, IT, OT divide been bridged in 2020?
Yes, indeed, James. I mean, the Industry 4.0 project are generally very large project and almost company-wide. And when you talk about this kind of transformation plan, one of the big issue identified by most of the analysts and the consulting firms in that space, they are basically saying that for Industry 4.0 project to be successful and execute well, the enterprise IT and OT teams really need to, come together to make it a success. And it's the same when it comes to the private wireless digitalization aspect of those projects that support this Industry 4.0. And this is something that, we are seeing more and more evidence that this is happening. In the past, the OT needs of asset-heavy industry were really driven by the OT team, and they tended to do their own thing in isolation. But, with computerization, the transformation from analog to digital, and that happened with the end of Industry 3.0, and still happening in some cases, and the full digitalization that's needed for the new Industry 4.0, the IT folks' involvement are absolutely essential. The same way that IT, cannot do it alone without considering the need and requirement from OT. The IT guys not working with the OT team will lead them to sometimes choose the wrong technology that won't be suitable for the critical use cases. So it is absolutely essential for those two teams to really work together as they are interdependent on the success of those Industry 4.0 projects. And I would say 2020 is probably, the first year where we saw concretely, those kind of thing happening. In the past, a lot of the private wireless projects were driven with a specific, use case in mind, or a specific challenge linked to the use of a certain, wireless technology, for example. And that was mostly driven by, sometimes very often the OT team, and sometimes as well the IT team. But in 2020, what we saw is that there's many more company-wide, Industry 4.0 projects that are taking place, where the OT and IT team, even at very high level, are brought to the table and defining the project and working towards the same goal. And we see that as a very important, aspect that we think over time will really help, accelerate, the adoption of private wireless in the market today, not just for a single app or single use case, but generically as a big transformation project for those industries.
Okay, so Stefan, let's talk about adoption then, because it seems every week, every day almost, there are new announcements about new enterprises making new private LTE and even early private 5G deployments. And Enterprise IoT Insights has quoted Nokia nearly 2 years back from analyst research that this market for private LTE and stretching to private 5G could reach 15 million venues potentially. I think the headline was 10 million factories, 3 million warehouses, 50,000 mines. Just talk to me about that, particularly with regards to the manufacturing space and about where we are now as the pace is gathered in 2020 and where we're headed in 2021?
Let's be clear at the same time. So I think the number you've quoted are, still very relevant. But so while, I would not even say yet that private wireless has become mass market in 2020. I think it will continue to take some years. I think if you take a look at as an industry overall, we probably only install private wireless networks in maybe 1,000 industrial sites. So it will take a lot of years for private wireless to become mass market, but we're really clearly seeing some obvious sign of acceleration across the board, whether in terms of the number of private wireless networks we're deploying, but also our opportunity pipeline we are seeing and we've seen in 2020. We also, 2020 for me was also the year where, private wireless became something that people understood. It's clearly has been now a hot new technology topic in the media with, several thousands of articles in the press and even reaching the big journals as well, very much like 5G that's been in the news for quite a few years now. And that clearly also helped, the discussion on private wireless. So I would say both, traction, but also, from a kind of aspect of general knowledge of the technology is clearly there in 2020. And like you've mentioned, there are, in excess of, 10 or 14 million industrial site potential for private wireless. So it's clear that private wireless will be a big market. And in that sense, the whole industry and a lot of stakeholders are really starting to pay close attention to the potential that mobile technology have in helping transforming those industry, the same way really they've transformed our life, or the consumer's life in the last 20 or 30 years with mobile phone. This is something that hasn't happened yet with industry, and now is the time. If we take a look at Nokia for just further evidence as a proof of that acceleration, when we started in 2015 and all the way to end of 2019, we managed to secure roughly about 120 customers. And just to put things into perspective, that is 120 customers in 4 years. While in 2020, just in the space of 9 months, we've almost doubled the number of customers, and we now have in excess of 220. So that really shows you, this acceleration. And one last thing, on adoption, which, I want to continue to reinstate because it's something that's sometimes not understood is the ecosystem aspect. The very important adoption factor is linked to the ecosystem. So effectively the industrial things that can connect to those networks. This is a very important piece of the puzzle, as you can imagine. Otherwise, those networks are not of much use. And this was the challenge when Nokia started deploying private wireless in 2015. And in 2020, we already saw that in 19, but in 2020, we are now really comfortable today that we have a strong ecosystem of 4.9G and LTE industrial device that support almost all the industrial use case of heavy asset industry that we are addressing. For example, I was reading, not long ago, I think last week, that narrowband IoT and LTM is now, really becoming mainstream and one of the most popular technology in all asset tracking devices. So clearly, we now have, the right thing we need. And today you can almost find any types of industrial system with an LTE or 4.9G chipset built inside, from sensors, from, connected factory tools to powered vehicles like straddle carrier, or worker safety equipment like helmets and vests, or even, massive 500 plus ton autonomous mining trucks now can come with effectively the ability to connect to those private wireless networks. And that also talks a lot to the traction and the progress we've made, in the last 5 years.
A major piece of the jigsaw here, which we spoke about a little bit in the last episode, is the availability of spectrum. And this trend, of course, goes back some way earlier than 2020, but 2020 is when it seems to have fallen into place, driven by, governments in most industrial markets, notably with CBRS in the US, but also with slightly different models in Europe and Japan. Just, if you can, talk around how spectrum liberalization has shaped up and shaken up the market.
Yeah, that's correct. Very much, a little bit like I was finishing the last answer around ecosystem. The other important aspect of private wireless is spectrum. And spectrum, was always seen as a challenge to the deployment of private wireless networks. But again, we saw over the year a lot of positive momentum, probably dating back from, around 2016 when the US, regulator, the FCC, agreed to release some shared spectrum to a wide variety of users, like enterprise that would not have had in the past, the ability to access such a licensed spectrum. So that really, helps really kickstart things off, as the US market is such an influential market. And then, we saw things rolling on from there. Clearly, the shared spectrum is an interesting aspect, but it is a bit more complex. And in some other markets, like in Europe, there are some, bits of spectrum that are not used or have not been auctioned to the CSP. And we're seeing some movement. We have seen some movement in that space, like in 2019. We saw France as an example that really followed the US model and was the first one to effectively commercially release a spectrum for the vertical, both in the low band for what they call kind of critical segments, transport, utility, or even public safety, but also for industrial sites, with the 2.6 gigahertz TD band. That was an auction at the time. And then we also saw, Germany, Japan, and the UK in 19 and 20 following a similar approach and releasing, quite a bit of spectrum for verticals, including spectrum suitable for 5G. So that's kind of, one aspect of it. And, we touched a little bit on that last time, but I just mentioned it again also, the CSP going in that space also come with their own range of spectrum that really helps, on addressing the spectrum. So I would say, 2020 is not, we've seen that spectrum is no longer an issue. And, when we expect the trend to continue, as more and more countries realize the potential that private wireless can play in this industrial digitalization agenda, and the impact it can have on just making industry just more efficient, but also more sustainable, which is very important nowadays, and also more resilient. Hence, altogether having a very positive impact on the economy, for those countries. So I think we'll see the trends continuing into 2021, and we're seeing it with 5G as well, 5G spectrum. The other thing I would mention on 220, looking back at what happened is 220, I started by talking about the US, and I think 2020 is also the year where the CBRS GAA spectrum finally gone commercial, following a lot of hard work over the years to really make spectrum sharing a reality with everything that involves. And then we also had this year the PAL auction, so the Priority Access License, so the second tier, that also attracted a lot of interest, clearly from a wide variety of mobile operators that use and plan to use CBRS in their own operation. But we also saw ISP, cable co, and also enterprise like utility, effectively, buying a spectrum license on a kind of regional level. So we expect that this overall effort by the US will in turn will become the model technically and maybe even commercially for spectrum sharing in other countries. And there's still a lot of spectrum in use in various countries, for example, by the military, that could be used and shared for other use cases at the same time. Then, maybe the final thing, which was not maybe something that was very evident in the past, but private wireless networks were, mostly for industrial sites so far. But at the same time, we know, and we talked about that in the last podcast, and there are many industrial segments like the rail, like utility, that needs really wide coverage as well. And in the area of spectrum for wide area coverage, you kind of need different types of spectrum. You need typically a lower spectrum that really enable you to cost effectively cover a whole country. And again, in 2020, we saw very positive news in that space with, the US, releasing some 900 megahertz band, 6 megahertz worth of, for utility, again, realizing the importance utility have in the future, and also in time like, the time we have with COVID today. And then in other places, we also, see the 400 and the 450 megahertz band that were formerly, used for 2G, radio technology such as CDNA, or for, wireless, connectivity in rural areas for houses, for example, also became available or put back to auction, depending on the country, after it was certified by 3GPP for use with LTE and 4.9G, and devices becoming available. So as I mentioned earlier, the 400 and the 450 megahertz really bring significant potential, for the critical vertical segments that we talked about, where they need that wide area of connectivity, or and sometimes the country decide to keep or give that spectrum to the critical IoT CSP or former ISP that had this spectrum, for them to develop and deploy an LTE nationwide network that they can then resell, critical connectivity services to enterprise with, as I mentioned, a spectrum that really allow a very economical way to cover a very large country with maybe only a few hundred cells. And it's really changed the whole business case for those wide area private wireless networks. So I expect a lot of that we'll see have an impact on 2021 also.
And Stefan, it's not all about licensed spectrum, right? Most of the industrial market is networked arguably at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz with Wi-Fi, at least for wireless comms. There are these kind of knee-jerk tales, if you like, about 5G eating everything. But the reality is, of course, more prosaic, that Wi-Fi is well entrenched and will continue to play a definitive role in the digital transformation of industry. And then on top, there is a whole bunch of stuff happening with cellular and indeed non-cellular technologies as well in unlicensed spectrum. Stefan, put all of that in some context for us, perhaps, and just touch as well on where we're up to with MultiFire, of course, as a vehicle to bring, LTE into unlicensed spectrum.
Yeah, definitely, you're right. I mean, as we talked about, there's a very large market out there and a whole swath of different companies and company size as well. And in my mind, unlicensed spectrum is clearly a key enabler and probably the last piece of the puzzle to really make private wireless go mass market and make it really suitable for even small companies, where even the aspect of getting a vertical license spectrum may just be too complex or costly or even too long. And there's no surprise either that 3GPP, even for 5G, is working on a version of 5G for unlicensed spectrum called 5G NRU. So I think this is clearly showing that the unlicensed has a key role to play in those markets. In addition, beyond the aspect of making things even simpler and more accessible for small company, the unlicensed spectrum actually opens up quite a few new use cases where a licensed spectrum is a little bit too rigid, and where unlicensed makes a lot of sense. For example, I've seen a lot of companies coming and see us at various trade shows and events in the construction space. They effectively set up a site, for 6 months, couple of years, or, if it's a large tower in Dubai, for example, and then the next time they'll go in Saudi or somewhere else to build another tower. So they kind of go around the country, they even go around the world most of the time, and it's a temporary site. And those folks, effectively, an unlicensed spectrum is perfect because it doesn't make sense to ask for a spectrum every time you move. It's complex, it's costly. With unlicensed, you remove that burden. The other one, which is even more suitable for the unlicensed spectrum, are those kind of sports events that goes around the world, the kind of venues, or the like take the PGA golf championship, take surf competitions or even ski competitions as well. They are in the same spot. They basically go over a period of 6 months to 1 year around the world, set up their sites. And unlicensed makes a lot of sense. So we see clearly a big role for unlicensed, opening up new opportunities even for private wireless in some market that we had not considered in the past. And finally, the other aspect of unlicensed spectrum is the fact there is a lot of bandwidth in it, and that's one of the key benefits in both the 5 gigahertz, but also the future 6 gigahertz. So there's a lot of scope as well for the unlicensed spectrum to be used to complement private wireless networks in country where there may not be enough bandwidth for capacity-heavy use cases in the vertical license spectrum or in the CSP, the spectrum that has been given, where you can use effectively an extra layer that uses MultiFire or even 5G NRU in the future, that can be added with a few small cells. It uses the same core network, the same infrastructure, to bring capacity layer on top of existing private wireless networks. And this is exactly what the CSP have been doing with their what we call HETnets. These are the CSP networks are now composed of multiple technology, but also multiple frequency. And then, some specific traffic are kept on one layer versus another because it brings more coverage. And other times, maybe video traffic is used on another layer where there's more capacity. And it's the same with private wireless. There's no reason why you could not effectively leverage different types of spectrum to give you, the different capabilities that you need. So we see a role for MultiFire to play an important role in complementing existing private wireless networks or future private wireless networks with more capacity. And generally, I think the folks that know me, know that MultiFire is close to my heart. And I was there when Nokia was the first to demonstrate multi-fire potential in 2017 with the industry first small cell that run multi-fire. Unfortunately, it has taken a long time to get a working device that we could use to connect assets and make them talk multi-fire in effect. And it's been a long journey for Nokia because we were the founding member of the Multi-Fire Alliance, and after the standardization in 2017, it took us quite a while to realize that a lot of the traditional chipset vendors would not support multi-fire in their consumer chipset or in their current chipset that's mostly targeted at mobile phones. So Nokia, after taking a little time to go around and ask all those folks, we decided to take the matter in our own hands. Before the topic was so important, and I think as I mentioned before, it's seen now that 3GPP has followed the Nokia's view on that, and we started developing our own industrial modems that we can use to make multi-fire private wireless a reality. So while we're still going through all the certification, actually many of them got delayed due to COVID closing a lot of labs around the world. But we just passed the certification with the Multi-Fire Alliance, with the interoperability testing, and we're confident we should get the rest of the certification we need to start be able to ship these units and really bring to market the world's first end-to-end private wireless solution based on unlicensed spectrum and make this multi-fire reality happen and access to those to that even wider market.
So, Stefan, what you said earlier about nationwide private wireless networks was really interesting. Just on this point of kind of national cellular infrastructure and what we can say about the role of the traditional operators in all of this, because there is a sense that with the availability of plug-and-play systems and the liberalisation of spectrum, that suddenly anybody can be an operator, and that there is some existential threat, if you like, to the traditional operator community. Now, clearly that's not quite the case, but just, Stefan, if you can, talk around that and what operators stand to gain from this market and what they can offer it, and how really they've perhaps finally embraced it in 2020.
Again, you're right. We have seen 2020 bringing really quite change in that space. So in the past, Nokia, as an example, had already partnered with quite a few CSP for private wireless. We had, for example, A1 in Austria or Bharti in India. But 2020 is really where we saw the very large CSP really walking the walk and picking up on the fact it was important for them to rapidly create an offering in a private wireless space. And just as example, we saw recently that Nokia signed both AT&T and Verizon, a very large CSP in the US. We also have a very important enterprise business, really taking the private wireless seriously and partnering with Nokia to develop an offer to target their enterprise customer. And also, we've got quite a few other operators we are trialing with, for example, Orange Business Services, where we're currently running a trial for a company called Schneider Electric in one of their factories in France. And there's many more like that. So generically, I think it's been also a pivotal year for the CSP in their development of a strategy and offering for private wireless. And I think it's important for because as many enterprise, for example, the SME or the company that rely also on the CSP for the nationwide connectivity, like logistics segments, there clearly seems to indicate a preference to get private wireless network from their trusted CSP. So I think many enterprises would be glad to find that they can work with a preferred CSP to get access to critical connectivity in their own sites as well. So altogether, a very positive thing for the industry.
Our thanks to James Blackman of Enterprise IoT Insights and Stefan Doble, Head of Marketing at Nokia Enterprise Solutions, for joining us today. Insightful as always to hear Stefan's thoughts on this fast-paced, exciting and genuinely meaningful part of the market. Thanks for listening to the Private Wireless podcast series from Nokia. Don't forget to subscribe and be the first to hear new episodes. If you're looking for more insights around all things private 4.9G LTE and 5G, contact the Private Wireless team at Nokia. To find us online, just search for Nokia Private Wireless and click Talk to an Expert to get in touch.